sorry, I didn't see you back there.
You're all right.
Welcome. Thank you for being here. And for those of you who are not aware of it, this we have this set up today because once a year, Dr. Ellen Edwards, who is the head of the children's program here, does a vacation Bible school, which is unlike vacation Bible school when you anticipate vacation Bible school. I promise you. It sells out every year, and I asked her the other week, Stephanie, does that mean that nobody could come? Nobody else could come? And she said, right, we're full. I said, what if we bribed you? And she said, that would work. She said, it will take $1,000 and another volunteer. So if you want to volunteer for our vacation Bible school, anyway, start tonight with all church dinner, and our senior pastor, Tommy Williams, will be back in harness for that, and then he will be here all of next Sunday. And if you did not attend the worship service this morning, I would invite you to attend the 11:05 service. Now, a lot of people are not aware of this, that the staff here are paid a percentage of how many people show up. So they figured a crowd.
Working on an airplane.
Working on an airplane. I've decided now to settle for a drone.
We have a broken one we can use.
I don't want a broken drone. So I hope you can stay. And so no matter who you are, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. When I knew that I was going to be preaching today, I asked Josh and Holly if they would be open to talking about their experience being in an interracial marriage and creating an interracial family. And I have thought about 3 ways that I could introduce them. I've known Holly longer than I've known Josh, and they, over the years, have become good friends, both Sherry and mine, and they put up with my jokes, and they commiserate with Sherry. The last time we were out, Holly said to Sherry, you have to live with this, don't you? Anyway, a memory that I have of you two is that in November of 2006, leading up to a date and that date and afterward, I performed this couple's wedding. And I have a hunch that I may remember more about that than you do.
Probably do. Yeah. I think you do.
I certainly remember some of the comments that your parents said, which I won't repeat here if you want to repeat them here. But I remember it was at an event site just down the street on Benn Street. Yeah, Parador. Yeah. And I remember looking out at the people who were gathered for that event, and it felt like I was looking out on an assembly of the United Nations. I mean, it was a really diverse group, and that was kind of exciting. In 1966, is that correct?
67.
67? Oh, okay. Yeah. I didn't mean to jump you.
Right.
About that. That was 1 year after I came to Houston. The Supreme Court declared that it was no longer against the law for couples of different races to marry. So that's good. I love the title that you have given to your talk, Loving Conversations. So I notice when I look out at our congregation, and you probably notice when you see commercials on television, there are more interracial couples. There are more interracial, bicultural families, multicultural families. That's certainly true for our congregation and for our culture. You just go to Central Market someday and look around at the people who shop there. We're living in a very diverse cultural city. So I have a bunch of questions that I may not even get around to asking. Who knows? But, huh? Let's start here. were each of you taught about race growing up?
It deferring to me first.
Ladies first, of course.
Well, I grew up in a white household, and I think that this is a common experience with people I knew who also grew up in a white household. We weren't taught much. It wasn't really talked about as a piece of identity or as how to relate in the world. I think now that that's an opportunity that was bypassed. How do we understand ourselves as white folks in America is an important question, as is how do we understand ourselves as Black folks or Hispanic folks or Asian, et cetera, et cetera. And I would venture to say, I can't know this for sure, that in the South specifically, when race is talked about in families that are white, it's often negative. In other words, it's about other races, not about what does this mean? What does this mean to be white in America? I think if I were doing my family now as a white person, I would talk to my kids about privilege, or I would talk to my kids about the history of race. We do, but in my household, it just wasn't talked about. That said, my dad's closest colleague for 40 years was a Black man. He's now dead. He's at our wedding. And I grew up calling him Uncle H. His name was Hosea. And on the one hand, we interacted with, I loved Hosea, I loved Uncle H. And on the other hand, he never came to our house for dinner. And they worked together for 40 years. Later in their life, I think there was a little more freedom with that. But I hold that in a kind of a great irony now. There's a bit of paradox in that. So.
For me, race was something that was talked about in my house a lot. I learned about it at a very early age. And it was a combination of, obviously, things you read in books, but also personal stories from, my own family. It was very much the opposite, I think, of what Holly experienced. My mom, I grew up in a single parent household. It was my mom and my little brother and myself. And I think as I've gotten older now and I've talked to my mom a little bit more about it, I think that the context in which I grew up, obviously my mom was raising two African American boys, sort of in the late 80s, early 90s in New Orleans, which is where I grew up. It was very, I think she was very purposeful in terms of the things she taught, mainly because she wanted us to be prepared for what we were going to encounter and face as we got older. So it was very intentional on her part, very intentional on the part of my uncles, cousins, and sort of older relatives who would talk to us about their experiences. And so we sort of learned context for ourselves through listening to their experiences.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but haven't you said to me that your mom taught you that you would have to do better than the average?
Yeah, so I was taught both implicitly and explicitly that in order for me to find success, I had to be twice as good. So I couldn't just be good enough. You had to be better. So, in school, you couldn't just make good grades, you had to make great grades. You couldn't, your behavior couldn't just be okay, it had to be great. Because essentially what I was taught was, so there was no safety net for me. So if I failed, then it would be difficult for me to continue to do the things that I wanted to do versus, if, my sort of white counterpart failed. So we got that incessantly, drilled into my head. So when I would, come home with my grades, I was always a pretty good student, and my mom would, I think she was good about motivating us, but that was one of the ways she would motivate us.
So one day you come home from wherever it is and you say, "Hey Mom, I'm gonna marry a white girl." And she says,
So
Your uncle goes, ooh, wait till
yeah,
baby
so
starts
my mom has two younger brothers. She has 4 siblings total. She has an older sister than her. Then I have 2 uncles, and my uncle Junior, who is.
Who I met first. I met UJ after Katrina.
Yes,
Who was
he's a troublemaker, and so he's the first one to find out. So
we had just started dating.
We had just started dating, and Katrina happened, and so I had been in Houston for a year, and I moved here from St. Louis, and so my uncle and my grandmother, who was alive at the time, came to live with me in my 1-bedroom apartment for a month after Katrina, and so he met Holly, and he began to realize, and then one day he pulled me aside, and he said, "Man, wait till," my mom's name is Janice. She's like, "Wait till Janice finds out that you're dating a white girl." He meant it in jest, sort of. And so when I did tell my mom, so I remember this conversation because it was over the phone. I did tell my mom, and what I told her first was that Holly and I were dating, and she was fine. I think she was, oh, I like to meet Holly, you know, that sort of thing. But then I told her that when I told her we were getting married, there was a pause. I remember an intake of breath, and then she said something along the lines of, well, first she said, "Well, are you sure?" And I said yes. And to her credit, she did acknowledge that it was a little difficult for her to hear. And the reason she said that was it had nothing to do with Holly, her not liking Holly as a person, or I don't trust this girl or anything like that. It was what she said to me was have you guys thought this through? And I said, what do you mean by that? And again, context matters, right? So my mom was born in 1955, and she grew up. She was born in a small town called Raceland, Louisiana. And so again, her experience, her view is informed by her experience, and so she was born in a time. So Loving was obviously in 1967. So my mom was 12 years old when this was sort of overturned, and so she has very sort of vivid memories of things are very separate, and so her charge to me was, well, have you guys thought about this? Have you thought about what that's going to be like for you? What if things that people will say? Having kids. What that experience is going to be like for your kids. And is that the right thing that you guys want to do? So it was more framed around her fears and concerns based on her past experiences of growing up in the Deep South, when obviously segregation and the keeping of very deliberate separate keeping of the races that was her experience, and so she couldn't let go of that experience. And I think Holly's parents, and they're a little bit older than my mom, so sure.
They were overjoyed, right?
It was similar, I think. I think we have to remember that in one generation between our parents and us, this has become legal. So there is a major paradigm shift. And it's my opinion that consciousness takes time to catch up to the law. So the law happens first, and now we're like embodying the law. Now we're all developing consciousness around this. So my parents had some similar feelings. Are you sure? And I remember my dad saying, I'm not proud of some of the feelings I'm having, and I'm scared, and marriage is hard. Do you want to make it harder? And I left that conversation, went home, and I think cried for a long time, because I was considering his perspective. I thought, am I going to lose my parents' respect or whatever relationship if Josh and I decide to continue to go forward in marriage? And that's not necessarily what they were communicating. There was no us or him kind of decision on the table. It was just an admittance of, I'm uncomfortable. And I don't know what to do with that uncomfort. So I went back to my dad, I think I shared this with you the next day, and said, thank you for sharing. I'm glad you can tell me what's coming up for you, but I am not getting married for you. I can't please you in this. And I want your support and I want your love, but I can't make a decision for my life based on what makes you comfortable. And that was hard. I was 30, so I was a grown up, but it was hard. And I think that both of our parents have appreciate me and Josh respectively. But I think in that generation there's a bit of an exception rule, like, oh, Josh is an exception, or Holly's an exception. But the truth is, we're both just exceptional. We're both just people navigating this life like anyone else, right? And I think what's kind of amazing, so this is us on our wedding day. Josh was actually going, are you really going to make me dance? I was like, yeah. That's actually the conversation that's happening in that picture.
It's true.
We just want, babe. In this shift, of legal to not legal to legal, if we sat at a table with our closest friends, we are all in interracial marriages. Almost all of our friends are navigating some kind of intercultural, interracial, or interreligious marriage. It may be that that's the bubble we've chosen. That is highly likely. And we look at, in the Lovings era, 3% of marriages were interracial or intercultural. I don't expect you to be able to read this. I'll explain this in a second. Now it's almost 20%. So this is not going to go backwards. This country that we live in has a lot of sickness and curses around race, for sure. And we're also trying to move forward. I think it's moving more forward in that way than backward. And I saw this, these were consecutive pages in the April issue of National Geographic. One says, and it was an issue dedicated to race. And they wrote this beautiful editorial about, we've exploited race in our magazine. We put the tribal African woman on the front, and they talked about that. It was a really beautiful editorial, and I encourage you to, I ordered the back issue of it. So one page is 50 years after Loving versus Virginia, where it says that almost 20% of marriages are now interracial. On the very next page is the rising anxiety of white America. And I think that's where we are. So in our marriage, we have normal wedding, marriage, did you throw the trash away today? Well, Josh, why didn't you make the bed? Holly, whatever. We navigate normal marriage stuff every day. We never argue, but just like everybody else here, right? We navigate that stuff. Our marriage is mostly normal. It's not special in any way. Well, it is. But you know what I mean, right? Because we're not. It's not like we're like. We are not the beacons of truth in the next generation of America. We're just trying to say we have a totally normal marriage, and we have this other layer that we, as an interracial couple, and with our kids, have to navigate. That I wish all of us were navigating together, regardless of who we're married to.
So, when you said we never fight, that's the first time in ordinary life's history that somebody told an untruth.
Wait a second.
So, if I had a magic wand, I think one of the things I would do is get everybody in this room to read Between the World and Me, and also Tears We Cannot Stop, which I know you both have looked at. Oh, I didn't know you were going to do that. Oh, yeah, I'll tell you talk about that. But there was an editorial in the Houston Chronicle or op-ed piece just yesterday about quit calling 911. Did you see that? Okay. So we know that we have a rising, as you call it, a rising tide of anxiety about racial issues. And I know that you could talk a lot about personal experiences, and we might get to that, but what has been your experience as a couple experiencing explicit racism themes?
You know, I'm thinking about, I was thinking about this question, Plum. I'm not sure if we, as a couple, we have experienced explicit racism. I think that, I think what we've experienced a lot is kind of one of the things that Holly talked about, where there's this notion that you're an exception, right? So, an early memory that I have, and Holly knows this, and I believe we talked to you about this example, when we, right after, it was our first year of marriage, we were actually going to visit my mom, who lives in Picayune, Mississippi now, and so we were driving there from here, and somewhere probably we had just crossed into Louisiana, and I wanted an IC. It's like, I'm in Louisiana, I want a sweet tea, so we stop at this gas station, and so I go in to the gas station, and there's a woman behind me, so I stop and open the door, which is what I was taught. And I go in, I get what I'm, the tea that I'm getting, and I go to the counter and I talk to the two young ladies who run the counter. I ask them how their day was, that sort of thing. I pay for it, and I remember saying something like, thanks ladies, you all have a lovely day. And one of the ladies behind the counter, she gives me this look and she takes a step back and no idea what's gonna happen. And she's like, I remember she says to me, and I told her, she's like, you're not like the rest of them. And I was like who? And she, you're so nice. And so it was a very awkward moment. So I just said, well, you ladies have a nice day. And I back out of the gas station. So I get in the car and I recount this to Holly. And it's just, there again, it's expectations versus reality. And so I think that for me, and I think for us, I think there hasn't been anyone who's sort of called us a bad name, or I'm refusing you service because you two are together. So there hasn't thankfully been none of that. But there've been these sort of little things that pop up where it's like, oh, I thought this, and now I don't know what to think. Sort of those kind of, again, going back to the exception piece.
How about your experience?
Likewise, I think we are fortunate in this way to live in an urban environment. I think this feels in some ways more comfortable and safer to raise an interracial family in an urban environment than in a small rural homogenous place. And I think more than anything, it's been more of an effort to kind of be like, this is where it can feel a little awkward, because I know that people's intentions are really good, but it's more like, wow, oh, wow, oh, just kind of more like, wow, you're married to a black man, and no one has said that overtly, but it sort of feels like that, and it's hard to sometimes navigate that. Like, I think you mean well, I think you're trying to say, you're safe here, or you guys are okay with me or with us, but the rebellious part of me was like, why is it important that we're okay with you? Of course we're okay, right? And so it doesn't feel ugly, it feels more like surprise.
Yeah.
So you one time said to me that you have, when Josh goes out to walk the dog at night, some anxiety.
He goes on these 2-hour walks.
Maybe there's somebody else.
I can walk the dog.
Yeah.
Oh, you just said that in this environment? Josh, you have something to say to me.
No, okay, so let's go back to that.
I'm confident in that, and I believe it.
So, do you have that anxiety now?
I do. I think with the rash of random killings of black men, black boys in our country, I do worry. And when Josh takes a long walk, I think we both feel safe in our neighborhood. We live in the Heights. It's not what I would say is super diverse, but it feels safe. It feels inclusive of us. And there's certain neighborhoods that I don't think we could feel that way. The neighborhood I grew up in, I don't think we could feel that way. I could be wrong, but in our neighborhood we feel. But I get worried. I think, what if the wrong person sees Josh walking down the street? I just hope that our big dogs are gonna turn ferocious in that moment. And, you know,
Probably not.
I don't know. One of them will be like, consent. The other one might. You know.
How about your boys? You have 3 boys.
Um,
Have they encountered racial stuff? Have they been called the N-word? You
They
know?
have not.
Thankfully, they have not been, that has not happened. So,
There's so much curiosity with kids. I'm over talking you, sorry.
no,
Yeah.
yeah, so we have 3
Yeah.
boys. Our youngest just turned 7 yesterday. So we currently have 2 7-year-olds and an 8-year-old.
Wow.
And,
We're not twins.
they're not twins. So when we decided to start a family, it was something that we, definitely had conversations about in terms of how will we parent, children who are bicultural heritage, and then obviously when we started producing boys, it became a conversation about, about sort of how to raise, sort of these interracial, male children. And I remember one of the earliest and most difficult conversations that Holly and I had. Obviously our boys, they're beautiful. We love them. They're part of Holly. They're part of me, and we want them to be able to identify themselves however they want. But I remember talking to Holly about the fact that while as a family we see them that way, and again, this is informed. What I'm about to say is informed through my own experience. But I know and I believe that regardless of their bicultural heritage, they're going to be seen as black men as they get older. And we have to teach them that, because we will be doing them a disservice as their parents. Because again, I like to define myself, I'm an optimistic realist. So I'm a very optimistic person, but I also live and deal in reality. And so the reality is, and I know that, you guys know, and we've learned in school and through, family tradition stories, sort of like even like the going back to the 1 drop rule, in terms of how you would be identified, that that our boys are still going to be seen in the eyes of society as young black men, and so we have to educate them on that. So I think that was tough. I think for both of us to talk about. I think that was tough for Holly to hear. I know that she's expressed fears about, if our children grow up and identify more closely with their African American heritage, what does that mean for her?
Like, I have this fear, will they resent me at some point? And I don't know that they will.
We have 3 mama's boys, and speaking as a mama's boy myself, I told Holly this, and I'll tell her this again in front of you guys. I mean, there's absolutely no way that our boys will somehow reject Holly, but I do understand that that's something we have to navigate, because they're going to navigate that too, and they are precocious, particularly our middle son. They do ask a lot of questions, and as things come up, I mean, we handle them in the moment, and we try to talk about things, but you can't ever anticipate where kids' minds are going to go.
Do they ask questions about this, about your marriage, or about race?
They ask questions about it. They're aware of skin differences.
Questions, though. Why does mommy have? They call me light brown, and daddy have dark brown skin, and so we kind of put our arms together and go, and it is this beautiful gradient of light brown to darker brown, and our kids are all in the middle. And so they do ask questions. And right now, one of my son's best friends is Chinese, and so he has a lot of questions about why do Chinese people have this kind of eyes? And so they ask questions too. It's not all kids ask questions. This one little boy came up to me and said, why does Caleb, my oldest, have curly hair and you have straighter hair? Why does he have dark skin and you have lighter skin? So you just answer, well, my husband has darker skin and I have lighter skin and he's in between. Kids go, okay. And kids kind of like, I'll share this story. I did this, so there was a project that came out, in the piece I wrote on the Ordinary Life blog, it includes this little story. my son got a project home from school that asked about ancestry, and I think the intent of the project was good. Let's talk about how people in America come from lots of different places, and that's the point of the project. But question number 5 said, what mode of transportation did your ancestors take to get here, and why did they come? It's a very different answer from my ancestors. They were on top of the boat. Josh's ancestry is most likely rooted in slavery. It is. And that's a very different answer. They came as prisoners, right? And I went back to the teacher and I said, I just want to make you aware that this question might be assuming one narrative. It might be assuming a really positive narrative, that everyone has this happy immigration story. And that's not so. That extends beyond black and white in our country, but it's just not so. And they kind of were shocked to hear that, oh, we hadn't considered that. I said, well, we're going to deal in the truth with our kids. Like, we're gonna share both stories, and it's going to be up to him which one he wants to share. And he got really fascinated by the story of slavery. And his picture that he drew, I wish I had brought that, was this elaborate drawing of what slaves did, and if they did something wrong, they went to jail, and there was this white man with a grimace on his face with a clipboard checking off if they did something wrong or not. He had this, this was not mommy saying, you need to draw this. This was completely his understanding. So his teacher is a wonderful teacher, said, will you come and just read some stories to the class, just kind of as we talk about this. So I came and I read this children's book about the Loving family, and I showed pictures of I showed pictures of our family, and I said, this family made us possible. And then I also talked about adoption. We have one son who is adopted. With his permission, I spoke about that. And so I had all this sort of here's how things have happened for us. And their classroom was a relatively intercultural space. And I said this story about how when we brought Coles home from the adoption agency, that we locked ourselves out of our house. And our neighbor, Bob, had to let us into our house because he had the spare key. So he was the first person to meet Cole. And Bob's daughter is in Caleb's class. You following me? So I made it special, Camila's daddy got to know Cole first. And Camila. And so the kids, they took all this in, and I said at the end, do you have any questions? And all the kids, the only thing they wanted to know was, did you ever find your keys?
You've been locked out of your house for 3 years.
Yeah. And kids are just that way. They're so curious. And I realized as a mother, it's not not talking about it. We have to talk about this. All of us should be talking about this. It's how do we respond? Do we engage their curiosity? Do we shut it down and say, that's not right? Or do we engage and say, why are you asking? Where's it? Tell me more. And I think for us, we've just learned to tell me more. Tell me more about where that question is coming from. The one thing, am I talking to you? Okay. The one thing that I think is really big for both of us, neither one of us are weapon owners, and we don't, we have probably strong feelings about that. In an urban environment, in my opinion, there's no need to own a gun. It just doesn't feel safe. It doesn't make me feel safer. But boys, how many older men in this room had a BB gun or a gun when you were little? So my boys want one, and I'm like, we're not getting one. And that reason is twofold. I don't love the gun industry, and my sons have brown skin. And down the street from us live 2 teenage boys who have BB guns, and they shoot them in their front yard. I have since asked their mom, can you just not have them shoot them in the front yard? It doesn't feel safe when we're walking. I know BB can't kill you per se, but it doesn't feel great. It can hurt. And my neighbor's kids are white. And so for her, there was no social safety issue in that. It was just oh, yeah, sure, we can have them shoot the BB gun in the backyard. And we live in the Heights. These are small lots. So if you shoot the BB gun in the backyard, they did, right? The neighbor's window. This is still an issue. But my kids, for a very different reason, I don't feel safe with them having a BB gun in the front yard. Because if they're playing with a BB gun, or even a plastic gun that looks like a real gun in the front yard, and a cop drives by, they're immediately a target. It's just the way it is. And if we don't deal in that reality, we won't be able to keep our boys safe, and we won't be able to help them navigate that. And I had to explain that to a 6-year-old. Here are all the reasons why I won't buy you a gun. For me, that's heartbreaking, to take away some childhood naivete and say, I'm not going to let you have a gun for this reason. But he has to know that. And that's something that as a white kid, you don't have to know. Tamir Rice is black. He was 12. He got shot in the park for having a fake gun that he was playing with his friends. You know, so this is the reality that we have to hold in our family. I don't know.
Well, no, that just kind of goes back to what we were talking about. And just kind of goes back to what we were talking about in terms of what we feel is our responsibility as parents to our 3 boys, and the realities, you know, in which we live and deal with. And so again, talking with them, and so like for example, Holly mentioned that's not necessarily how she grew up. That's exactly how I grew up. Right? So I got these lessons. I got well, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do, and here's why. And so I definitely feel as if, you know, we certainly need to, you know, while it's in some way, you know, potentially taking away something from them or diminishing some fun that they like to have, again, we still have a responsibility because we're responsible for their safety, to let them know these things.
Without imposing this adult projected fear onto them.
I'm really torn about how to go from here because I know you've got stuff. I want to get out of the way, and I got 1,000 questions. So both of you, so I'll just shut up.
Okay.
Well, I mean, really, I would love to ask. I hear things I'm thinking. Why do you think racism, expressions of racism, are on the rise in this country? That's one thing. And I would like for you to share, I don't know that we have time for this, but your experience of going to the memorial in Alabama, the lynching memorial. And I'd like to know what else you've got on your slides and all that stuff. So there's a smorgasbord.
Yeah.
Pick something.
Why is it that I think racism is
On the
Or
rise.
expression of it, yeah.
You know, I
Expressions of racism.
Yeah.
I think that there's been a lid kept on
there.
the racist history of this country and the racism in the country. But for the most part, people have had the good sense not to say whatever thought fell into their mouth.
Right.
But now we don't live in that kind of culture. You can just,
I mean, I don't necessarily think that there's one. I think it's a result of a lot of things. You know, I've had conversations with friends and family members about this particular issue. It's like, what is going on? Like, why all of a sudden are people crazy? I think that it's not. There's no one sort of genesis point. I think there are a lot of pinpricks that have been happening. Whether it's, I think whether it's people feel, a lot of it is resistance to change. You know, people feeling as if they're losing something. Because we hear talk a lot about the way things were, you know, and actually, this is a part of a, you know, Holly's dad sent us this email once. There was a column from David Brooks, who's a New York Times columnist, opinion writer, where at David Brooks, he spends a lot of time at times talking about sensibilities that we've lost, how the past was great. And I read this article that Phil had sent us, and you know, a couple people were chiming in, like, yeah, we just don't do it like we used to. And I recall this, again, it's one of those things where, again, your experience informs what you think, because like a lot of black people don't want to go back to the sensibilities we had in 1950.
Yeah.
Because things weren't great for us. But sometimes, Brooks writes in this way where it's like, the 50s and how we looked out for one another, and we need to, you know, go back to that. And it's like, well, you're taking all the good stuff, but you're papering over all the other stuff that happened, you know. And so I think that there's this sense of loss, someone else gaining something means that you're losing something. There's like this whole, like, you know, I'm sure we've all heard like the pie analogy, you know, you get your slice of the pie, you get your slice of pie, and I feel like that's been a large part of it. One of the things that I wanted to read this, I brought this in, this is actually tied into the Experience Memorial. There's a guy, his name's Brian Stevenson, he's a lawyer, he runs a center called the Equal Justice Initiative. He spends time defending and representing people on death row who, you know, can't afford representation. And he was the driving force behind the new Peace and Justice Memorial in Montgomery, which is commemorating the lynchings across the South. He participated in a conversation, I think it was last year, and they put the transcript in a book. And he, as part of his conversation, someone asked him a similar question, and his response really struck with me, and I brought it. I didn't know if I'd have a chance to read it, but it looks like I do. So here's what he says. He says, "For me, the challenge that we face is a narrative battle. I don't think we've actually done very effective narrative work in this country. We had a genocide in America. When white settlers came to this continent, they killed millions of native people through famine and war and disease, and we forced those people from their lands. We kept their names, we named streets and buildings and counties and things after them, but we forced them off. And because of a narrative shift, we didn't say, that's a genocide. We said, those people are savages. And that narrative failure to own up and acknowledge their humanity allowed us to think that we hadn't done anything immoral, but we did. And then we had slavery and the Civil War. The North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. The South was able to persuade the United States Supreme Court that racial equality wasn't necessary. And they actually reclaimed a racial hierarchy, that ideology of white supremacy. And we allowed that to happen for 100 years. Then we had horrific terrorism and violence. We ended the mass lynchings with impunity, but those who perpetrated that terrorism and violence won the narrative war. They were never held accountable. And then we got into the civil rights era, where there was this massive, incredible movement led by extraordinary people like Dr. King and Rosa Parks. We won passage of the Voting Rights Act. We won passage of the Civil Rights Act, but we lost the narrative war. The people who were holding the signs that said segregation forever and segregation of war, they were never forced to put down those signs. They didn't wave them around anymore, but they kept adhering to that value. And now we're living at a time where that thriving narrative of racial difference, that ideology of white preference has exhibited itself, and now we're dealing with the consequences of that. And that, I remember reading that, and I told Holly about it. I went down to the memorial with a colleague of mine, which I can talk about in a second here, but I read this on the plane, and it just struck with me, and I think about my own experiences, and I think about history, and he's right. There were many battles that were won, but I think that the narrative, is, we being people who are interested in justice, equality, and recognizing basic humanity, I think we lost that. And I think that by losing that, now we didn't recognize that until now, and so we're dealing with the repercussions of that.
You know, you use the word narrative in this, and what I'm using is story, and we're between two stories.
Right.
Yeah.
We're between a story that doesn't work anymore,
Yes.
and we don't have a new one in place, but we're working to do that.
Say the last thing that I would add is, we were similar to what you said, and this was on a podcast that I listened to that said, all of us have implicit biases, right? I think if we're really honest with ourselves, we have implicit biases. It's just part of being human. And this guy interviewed said, most of us think we are better than we really are, but we live in a world with an unfortunate history that is passed down in concept form from generation to generation. I now can make myself more like what I want to be. If I spend my life denying this other self, this implicit bias, then I'm letting my other self operate and influence my behavior. I'm letting myself go through life with blinders. And once you understand that you have this other self, it's not your enemy, it's the human part of you. And I go on to write, I think it's our best teacher. It's the best teacher that can kind of open us up to where we still need to open our hearts and see not an other, see differences. Differences are what make us beautiful. But it's the otherness. Josh is no other than I am. I am no other. You say this all the time. I am not God.
I'm not
I
other
am
than
not
God.
other than God.
I'm not you.
I'm not you either, but
Right.
I'm not other than you.
Right.
And that, I think that alone just feels like probably maybe the most powerful way we can hold that space is
Tell us about this and
I
then we'll
love,
quit.
yeah. So Langston Hughes, Josh's mom, has sent you a lot of Langston Hughes poems. But I love this poem. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America.
Wow. Well, I'm glad that you all have had a chance to have a little bit more of a close-up picture of, these are your boys. Wow. I remember when they were all under 3,
Now they're all under 8.
and you were crazy.
Oh, I still am. That's not going away.
Can't imagine that.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you all had a chance for a close-up with these folks. And I love you both, and I'm so glad you do this. And say to all of you, no matter who you are, no matter where you go this week, remember this, you carry precious cargo, so watch your stuff, and I will see you at the 11 o'clock service.